seconds, give everybody a chance to get settled, and then we'll begin. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jack Samet. I'm the president of PLAT'O, and so far as I know, there's been no litigation or other proceedings to challenge that, so we'll proceed accordingly. First, I want to wish everybody in attendance a happy Thanksgiving. This is going to be a fairly complicated Thanksgiving for everybody, but I'm sure we'll find a way each to find our own happiness and our own family and personal units and have the happiest Thanksgiving we can. I have two announcements to make before we begin. Both have to do with buttons. One has to do with the submit button on the member website. And that, of course, is the button that you press after you've completed your registration choices. And that's an indirect way, or maybe a direct way, of reminding everybody that registration is now in progress for the next trimester, the one that begins in January. The response so far has been excellent, and it's important to complete your registration before the close date if you want to be in on the first registration run and have a better chance at choice of the classes and SDGs you prefer, rather than take what's left. So by all means, if you haven't already registered, please do so before Thursday, November 27th. And that brings me, Thursday, November 27th, brings me to the second button that I want to talk about, which is the Make an Online Payment button on the member website. That's a new addition to the member website. It's across the top menu bar. And of course, that's the one that you can use to make your contribution to PLATO's annual giving fund. We hope that in connection with the Thanksgiving season and the end of year, which is the tax deduction season, with both those seasons upon us, we hope you will consider making a donation generous to the extent of your comfort level to PLAT'O for all that it has done and will continue to do to provide its services and experiences for everybody during these difficult times. With that, I would like to introduce the chairperson of our colloquium, and that is Hank Zangwill, who will introduce today's speaker. Hank?
Thank you very, very much, Jack. It's my pleasure today to welcome to our PLAT'O colloquium Dan Schnur, who's always been one of the most popular speakers that we've had at our colloquium. I'm looking at the buttons at the bottom of the screen of people that are starting to enter, and it appears that once again, Dan, you will be attracting a wonderful audience. For those of you who are not familiar with Dan, he is a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications and at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. He's a founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. He's been teaching courses in politics, communications, and leadership at UC Berkeley since 1996 and at USC since 2004. Dan has also taught at the John F. Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics at Harvard University and at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. In addition to everything else, he still has time for what is a wonderful webinar that you should take advantage of every Thursday morning on the website of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, where Dan hosts a webinar on politics in the time of coronavirus. And if you have not had the opportunity to tune into that, please do. And for those of you who have any questions, and indeed I'm sure you will, at the very bottom of your screens where it says Q&A, just click that, type in your question, and we'll get to it at the end of Dan's presentation. Please do not use the chat feature, use the Q&A feature, and we'll be able to get to your questions at the end of Dan's presentation. With that, Dan, welcome to PLAT'O. We look forward to your talk as usual.
Well, Hank, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for being willing to have me back, particularly in an election season. Like a lot of political science types, I get asked to give talks from time to time to organizations like yours, maybe not quite as well respected, but very good organizations in themselves. But it's relatively rare that I get invited back. So if nothing else, I really admire your optimism and your persistence. I know that many of you have attended my presentations to PLAT'O before, but I also can tell by the very flattering size of today's group that many of you have not. So the first thing I'll do even before I get started is answer the obvious question that's running through the minds of a lot of PLAT'O members and loyal UCLA Bruin advocates. So what in the world is Hank doing bringing a Trojan to us? And I will tell you this just to clarify. One, although I have had the privilege of teaching at USC for many years and for Berkeley Berkeley as well, and Pepperdine more recently, I am very proud that one of the other things I get to do in the community is I was very humbled to be asked some years ago to be a Luskin Fellow at the UCLA School of Public Affairs, in which I have the opportunity to work with some really amazing graduate students in public policy every year. So I might not be as much of a Bruin as I am a Trojan, but I do stake at least some claim to your campus, and I'm grateful that you're willing to have me back, even if just virtually. But that said, I am going to offer you, as someone coming from crosstown, I am going to offer you a little known fact about the state of California. Most people don't know this, although my friend Ben Allen certainly does, but most people don't. I learned this some years ago from former Governor Gray Davis. What the governor told me, and I've looked this up, he's absolutely right. She told me that he said, Dan, if you were to draw a line across the state of California, if you were to draw the line across horizontally from the Pacific Ocean to the Nevada border, to divide the state in half. But if your goal was to divide the state in half, not geographically by acres or by square miles, but by population, so that 20 million people were to the north of that line and 20 million people were to the south, you would draw that line right through downtown Los Angeles. And in fact, he said more specifically, you would draw that line right down Wilshire Boulevard. And I've checked it out and it's absolutely true. And so what that means, as near as I can tell, is for all of you Bruins who've joined us today, you all are alums or supporters of one of the finest universities in all of Northern California. And so me and my USC friends have no problem with you at all. Bring it up with Stanford. Okay, enough of that. Let's get down to work. Hank asked me to come back to talk with all of you today about the election and its results. And what I'd like to do is offer thoughts from a couple of different perspectives. One, to offer some of my own observations on what happened in this election. And then second, particularly for a group like this one, to put it in some type of historical perspective. So let's start out with 2020, and then we can work to expand the conversation from there. The first thing I would tell you about the 2020 election, at least at the national level, and we can talk state level politics as well if you'd like, is at the national level in this year's election, how little happened that we expected, how few of the outcomes were anticipated. Now, most of the country assumed that Joe Biden was going to be elected president. But most of us also assumed that he was going to win the election by a much larger margin than he did. And it was widely expected that Democrats would expand their majority in the House of Representatives rather than seeing it diminished, and that they would achieve a sufficiently sizable majority in the US Senate that the outcomes of the runoff elections scheduled in January in the state of Georgia would not be nearly as relevant and not nearly as seminal as they currently are. So the question is then, what happened? Why did the results turn out so differently than had been expected? And I'll offer you a couple of my own thoughts, and then in short order, I'll look forward to hearing what all of you think when we move from monologue into question and answers. So the first thing I would offer, because often, particularly when I talk to my students, both at Cal and SC, they say with some frustration, they say, what did Biden do wrong? What did his campaign do wrong that made it that close, that meant that there weren't any coattails? And my own opinion is that while it wasn't a flawless campaign, that Biden and his campaign did very little wrong. In fact, they ran an excellent campaign. And so the question is less a matter of what Joe Biden and his team did wrong, and more a matter of what Donald Trump and his team did right. As the Trump campaign told us, they would say through the news media and any available audience all year long, they would say that they believed that they could motivate their core base of supporters to turn out at historically unprecedented levels. And you know what they did? They did. That white working class voting cohort that has been the base of Trump's support since he ran for president back in 2016 did turn out big for him. His advisors told us and told the body politic, they said that we identify large numbers of working class voters from small town and rural America who support the president, but who didn't vote in 2016. So we think there's even a larger vote for him in 2020 than there was 4 years ago. And once again, they were right. And it wasn't quite enough to elect him president. Obviously, he fell just short. And if there's anyone in the room who disagrees with that assessment, I understand that the argument is still going on, but I think we ought to agree at this point that the election, for all practical purposes, has been concluded. But the Trump campaign, while coming up just short, was right. There was a very large reservoir of untapped Trump voters out there, white working class voters from rural and small town America who had not voted in 2016 and who he did succeed in turning out this year. In that unexpected influx of voters from Trump's base, more than anything, is what made the outcome closer than anticipated and what helped fuel Republican gains in the House of Representatives and protect against further losses in the Senate. So quick matter of historical perspective, but we'll come back to that in more detail in just a little bit. Donald Trump's campaign strategy, motivating his most loyal supporters, that's nothing new. That's something that smart people in both parties have been doing for a long time. Now, when I came up in politics a long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, what I learned back in the 20th century, just like friends of mine in both the Democrat and the Republican Party, is we learned what was called the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule told us, as its name implies, the 80-20 rule told us that you spend 80% of your time on a campaign and 80% of your money on a campaign talking to the middle 20% of the voters, because of course that's the difference between winning and losing. But over the last few decades, over the last generation, that thinking has shifted. And more savvy political operatives in both parties have decided, with some justification, that it's much more time and cost efficient to devote your resources not to persuading undecided voters, but rather to motivating your most loyal supporters. And that trend has accelerated and intensified every 2 years and every 4 years for the last few decades. And so what Donald Trump did in 2016, and again almost this year, was nothing new. He took a strategy that's been in place for some time. He just pushed it beyond where it had ever gone before. Donald Trump, in other words, doesn't spend most of his time talking to his most loyal supporters. He spends all of his time talking to his most loyal supporters. And there were two issues in particular that he used to his benefit in order to achieve the election results that we've all seen. So what are those two issues? The first is COVID. The first is the coronavirus. We know from public opinion polling throughout the year, or at least since March, we've known for most of the year that a voter who says that that the pandemic is the most important issue for them in selecting their next president, those voters supported Joe Biden in overwhelming numbers. Voters who said the economy was the most important issue to them supported Donald Trump in almost as imposing numbers. Now look, you're smart people, and you understand, as do I, that in fact the two issues are inseparable, and that COVID and the economy are inextricably interwoven. But think about it in terms of priority. If you're concerned about this challenge, as we all are, but you believe that the first priority needs to be confronting the disease, the virus itself, then you're much more likely to support Biden, and he and his fellow Democrats campaigned accordingly. If you believe that reopening the economy was a greater priority, then he supported Trump and other Republican candidates. And what happened on Election Day was something unexpected. A much larger percentage of the turnout on Election Day said that the economy was the most important issue to them. More than a third of the voters put the economy first, and only about 20%, only about 1/5 noted COVID. And not surprisingly, that ended up skewing votes toward Trump and toward other Republicans, giving that prioritization. The other issue was crime. The other issue was crime and public safety and criminal justice. Back last spring, in the immediate aftermath of the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the American people in very, very, very sizable majorities supported the protests, the demonstrations, the marches that arose. But as the summer and fall went on, the American people became much more equivocal, became much more conflicted about what they thought of those protests and those rallies. And as the campaign wore on, as Trump began talking, in my own personal opinion, in somewhat overly strident terms, to the point where it may have driven some suburban voters in the other direction. But Trump, by continuing to emphasize law and order and public safety, and because Trump and his fellow Republicans latched onto the phrase defund the police, they were able to use the criminal justice issue to motivate a much larger percentage of Trump's base than had been expected, and to persuade a large number of swing voters, particularly older voters and suburban voters, who had shifted to Joe Biden in the early months of the pandemic, to shift back to Trump. So COVID and crime, I would suggest to you, were the two reasons that we saw the results that we did. And then briefly, before we do turn this monologue into a conversation, which every time I come to PLAT'O is my favorite part of the program, I do want to take a couple minutes just to put this into some historical perspective. Because this white working class voting cohort that I've spoken about is obviously nothing new in American politics or American society, but its role in American elections has changed very much over the last few decades. And let me explain my thinking. For most of the 20th century, the most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior, the most reliable indicator on whether you would vote for a Democrat or a Republican candidate for president, was income. The more money you made, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote Democrat. But then a couple of things happened. First, in the 1990s, smart Democrats like Bill Clinton and Dianne Feinstein and others of that era began reaching out very aggressively to a group of swing voters, and some of you may remember the term, a group that became known as soccer moms. And soccer moms and soccer dads, because it was a phenomena that encompassed both genders, soccer parents, if you will, were suburban voters who ostensibly drove their children to soccer practice in their minivan, hence the name. That these soccer parents, these suburban voters who are economically successful and therefore generally more economically conservative, but also more socially moderate to liberal. And Clinton and Feinstein and other Democrats reached out to these voters on issues like abortion rights and gun control. And as years passed, issues like same-sex marriage as well. And they convinced this entire group of swing voters, these soccer moms and soccer dads, to prioritize social and cultural issues over economic policy. Now, at the same time the Democrats were doing that, Republicans weren't just sitting and letting it happen. They were reaching out to another group of potential swing voters. And this group, although the name didn't catch on quite to the same degree, this group became known as NASCAR dads. NASCAR dads, in fairness, NASCAR moms, but working class blue collar voters who are economically populist, but culturally and socially conservative. And what smart Democrats like Newt Gingrich and Karl Rove and others did in the early 2000s is they reached out to this group of swing voters and said, just like Clinton and the other Democrats did in the other direction, suggested to them that instead of voting on economic policy, they should cast their votes on social and cultural issues, issues like abortion and guns, and as the years passed, same-sex marriage. So what we saw over a 20-year period was an immense trade between the two parties, soccer moms for NASCAR dads. And so what happened is by the 2004 election, when George W. Bush defeated John Kerry in a closely contested campaign, as many of you remember, by 2004, that indicator of partisan voting behavior, that primary indicator of partisan voting behavior, was no longer income. Rather, starting in 2004, and intensifying every 4 years since then to a greater and greater degree. The single most reliable indicator on whether someone will vote Democrat or Republican for president is no longer income or wealth or financial considerations. Rather, it's what they call religiosity. And religiosity, of course, is not the faith, the religious faith that you practice, but rather the intensity with which you practice it. If you go to church or synagogue once a week or more, you're far more likely to vote Republican than Democrat. If you go to church or to synagogue once a month or less, you're much, much more likely to vote Democrat. Now, I don't take sides in this. Everyone makes those decisions for themselves. Me, I'm from the John Stewart approach to religion. He likes to say, I'm not all that religious. I'm just sort of Jewish. So I come in somewhere in the middle there. But that frequency of attendance of religious services and intensity of religious belief has signified a tremendous change in American politics from an era in which economic issues drove most people's votes to an era in which social and cultural issues did. And what Trump did to a much greater degree than his Republican predecessors is reached out to those white working class, those blue collar voters, appealing to them not on economic, but on cultural and social matters. And he brought large numbers of them into this fold. Where this heads going forward is a longer conversation. And what I would just as soon do, rather than unilaterally continuing the conversation in that direction, is I just soon stop for right now. Because like I said, when I've come to PLAT'O before, as much as I always enjoy speaking and offering my thoughts to you, what I've always enjoyed much, much more is hearing your thoughts and hearing your questions and comments and doing my best to answer as many of them as possible. So with that, Hank, if it's all right with you, I will wrap up the diatribe and let's allow some smart people to weigh into this discussion.
Okay, one of the questions we've gotten is, what chance do you think there is that some governors, or I suppose state legislatures, will ignore the popular vote and appoint their own representatives to the Electoral College?
Well, it's a great question. And what I left out of my own presentation, in the interest of time and making sure that we had time for as many of your questions as possible, is I chose to focus just on the election past as opposed to what now happens going forward. And the question is a very smart one. What are the chances of having Trump overturn the traditional process for selecting electors for the Electoral College? In most states, the question that's come up is not about governors changing the electors, but rather state legislatures. And that's for two reasons. One, with the exception of the states of Georgia and Arizona, all of the states that are currently contested have Democratic governors. So it wouldn't do Trump a great deal of good at this point. But it's provided for in the Constitution, and these are where these questions come from. The Constitution specifically states that it is up to state legislatures to decide how electors from a state shall be selected. Now, for many, many years now, for over a century, the legislature has made in every state has made the decision to cede that decision to a popular vote of the people. Obviously, that wasn't the case back in the days of the founders, but a long, long time ago, every state legislature decided that rather than them picking the electors, it should be done by popular vote. But the Constitution still says that it's the legislator's responsibility. So the question that came up in the weeks before the election is, could a Republican-controlled legislature, which they have in the state of Michigan, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the state of Wisconsin, in the state of North Carolina, just to name a few, could those legislators rescind the selection of the electors from being a result of the popular vote and make that decision themselves? And the answer is yes, with one big however. While the Constitution does allow the state legislature to decide who electors will be, they can only make a change in that process before the election. Once the election has taken place, the legislators no longer have the ability to change the way electors are selected. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Michigan State Legislature had gotten together on Monday, November 2nd, and decided, we don't think the people of our state should decide who the electors should be. We will. They could have, according to the Constitution, passed a new state law that gave them back the power to make those decisions themselves. But now that the election is passed, that's no longer permitted. And so while the Trump organization and its allies in some of these contested states are making noise along these lines, there is no constitutional basis whatsoever for state level officials rescinding this decision process from the voters. The Trump people are going to be trying any number of other ways over the next weeks to overturn the results, but that one at least does not have any constitutional ground to stand on.
Hey, one question that I know that has been very much discussed following the election is how the polls perform. We have Nate Silver, who tries to defend the polling, and at least on a national basis, arguing that the margin of error is within what one would expect in a national election. There are others who claim that, especially on the state and local level, the polling was dramatically off. How do you view the polling, and how do you think the pollsters overall did?
The pollsters didn't do all that well. And I say this as one who used to practice that art, the USC Times poll back in the day, although I'm no longer involved in it. I guess I'd offer a couple of thoughts, Hank. One, the polls were off in terms of the ability of predicting the outcome. But what I'd suggest to all of you, and I'm not rationalizing because I don't have any stake in how the polls performed this year, before we go any further, it's worth remembering what public opinion polling is designed to do. What a poll is not designed to do is to be predictive. Pollsters are not fortune tellers. They're not trying to see the future. But if you use a public opinion poll as a voter, as a news consumer, for the purposes for which it's intended, you should not use it to forecast an election that is days or weeks or months away. Rather, the most valuable resource that a poll presents is not to tell you who's going to win, not to guess in advance which candidate's going to emerge victorious. Rather, what polling is designed to do is to tell us what voters think and why they think it. So in other words, the horse race, the A versus B, the Trump versus Biden, the Schnur versus Engel, we all know how we'd vote in that particular race, by the way. That's not what polls are for. And what the Gallup poll did, probably the gold standard in American public opinion research for a century now, the Gallup poll several years ago decided they would no longer do that kind of horse race polling at all. They still ask whether we think favorably or unfavorably of the candidates. They still ask what we like and don't like about them. They still ask what issues are important to us and what we'd like to see done on those issues. But they don't ask the horse race question anymore because they recognize, I think accurately, that no matter how many times they say that polls aren't designed to predict an outcome of an election, that human nature flies in exactly the other direction. In other words, it's part of being a human being to want to know what's going to happen before it does. I want to know who's going to win Sunday's football games before they're played. I can't help myself but to guess how this season of The Crown is going to end up, even though we've only watched the first few episodes, and I don't want anyone to spoil it for me, please, if that's okay. Because it's human nature, and because news media recognizes that human nature and realizes they can draw a much larger audience, a much larger number of viewers, a lot more clicks by marketing polls that way, we tend to use them for something that they're not designed for. So from my perspective, if more news organizations were to do what Gallup, more polling entities were to do what Gallup does, and simply stop asking the candidate A versus B question, we could go back to using public opinion research for what it's designed to do, to tell us what voters think about the issues of the day and what should be done about them. The problem with trying to predict the future, and then I'll wrap this up, but it's a really important question, Hank, and I'm glad you asked it. The problem with trying to predict the future, of course, is we can't. And when a poll is taken, you've all heard the phrase, it's a snapshot in time. But it's not just a snapshot in time on how someone's going to vote. It's a snapshot in time on whether they're going to vote or not. And that's the much more important consideration. Because a relatively small number of people change their opinion on who they're going to vote for over the course of the campaign. It doesn't happen all that much. But people have different levels of intensity and motivation. And so when they talk to a pollster about an election that's months or weeks or even several days away, they don't know how they're going to feel on election day. And so when the polls tend to miss, like they have in 2020 and 2016 and 2012, when they underestimated in 2012 the margin of Barack Obama's victory, they're generally off not because they get wrong who people are going to vote for, but how likely they are to vote. In this month, for the second election in a row, those white working class voters from rural and small town America voted much larger numbers than most had expected. The same way young people and voters from communities of color voted in unusually large numbers in 2012 during Obama's reelection campaign. So the polls were off if you try to use them for something they weren't designed for. To me, the answer isn't to beat them up because they can't do what they weren't designed to do. It's to begin using them for what their original purpose was instead.
Is there any evidence to support the suspicion of some analysts that conservative voters are less likely to participate in polling? Not that they would lie to the pollsters, but they wouldn't participate in polling at all. And for that reason, the number of potential voters for Trump was underestimated.
That is a legitimate concern. For one of the reliable predictors on level of voting participation, or two of the reliable indicators historically have been income level and education level. And for many years, pollsters struggled to get an accurate sample in minority communities because voters from communities of color, unfortunately, tend to have achieved less of an education level and less of an income level than white voters have for much of our country's history. So over the years, they've made adjustments to make sure that those communities' voices are heard in the polls in the percentage that they deserve to. Right now, pollsters are having a similar struggle, not with voters from minority communities, but with working class voters, voters who lack a college education and who tend to be who tend to be working class. So a voter with less of an education, a voter from a rural community or a small town is going to be less likely to respond to a poll. And the public opinion researchers are still figuring out exactly how to calibrate that. As we learned this month, they're still figuring it out.
Okay. What happened to the blue wave for the congressional election results?
Okay. Well, the answer on what happened to the blue wave is the same answer as why Biden's margin was not larger than expected. That Republican core vote, or that Trump base vote, the white working class voters from rural and small town communities, turned out in unexpectedly large numbers. As I said a little bit earlier, the primary reasons for that were COVID and crime. And so when you change the makeup of the electorate that dramatically, they don't just turn out to vote for Trump rather than Biden. They vote Republican down ticket too. And so that's what kept the blue wave from achieving the impact that many people had expected.
Okay. What do you think the chances are for the Electoral College Compact to succeed, which I understand that is an agreement among certain states to have their electors cast their electoral votes in accordance with the national results?
I think it's unlikely. Ultimately, you're asking a state to give up its primacy in order to, for all practical purposes, become part of a national popular vote. And if you're a state with a smaller population that has disproportionate representation in the Electoral College, there's not much incentive to do so. But I'd offer this as well real quickly as it relates to the Electoral College. If I were going to be running a presidential campaign in 2024, which I am not, but if I were, and you were to come to me and say, hey, Dan, we got rid of the Electoral College, there's now a national popular vote, how are you going to elect how are you going to elect your candidate president? I'd say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to rent an apartment for her out by LAX. I'm going to rent her another apartment by JFK Airport in New York. Get her a third apartment near O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Another one near Bush Airport in Houston. And you know what? Maybe Phoenix, maybe Dallas, probably not. And then I'm going to fly my candidate to the 4 or 5 largest metropolitan areas in the country over and over again all election long, because that's where I'm going to find the votes I need to win. And if you think the blue-red divide is a difficult one under the Electoral College, imagine what it would be like if Los Angeles and 4 other metropolitan areas elected a president over the objection of the rest of the country. There's probably a good compromise if the rest of the states were to do what Maine and Nebraska does, which is the award their electoral votes individually rather than on a winner-take-all basis across the state. But I worry that getting rid of the Electoral College altogether would exacerbate our nation's divisions rather than help heal them.
Okay, is there anything that could happen on December 13th, or I would just expand it to any time between now and inauguration, that would undo Biden's election as president?
It's pretty unlikely. Starting tomorrow, when the state of Georgia certifies its vote, until December 8th, when the last of the 50 states will have certified, gradually what is at this point an unofficial set of results becomes official. On December 14th, each state formally designates its electors to go to the Electoral College and have their votes formally counted in January in Washington, D.C. But I think at this point, the likelihood of the election being reversed is, I think, infinitesimally small. And more important, the fact that I think that is from what's been reported in the last day or two, it appears that the president and his advisors are coming to understand that also. And in fact, there was a fascinating article in this morning's Washington Post, which I'd recommend, that explains that the president and his team have largely concluded that the contesting the results the way they are is almost impossible to succeed. But rather what their strategy has now become, rather than overturning the results of the election, is delaying those results from becoming official for as long as possible. And that's primarily for political purposes, to keep the president's strongest and most loyal supporters as excited and motivated for him for as long as possible. So when, not if, but when he leaves office, that level of excitement will ideally sustain as he determines what next goals he's going to pursue. So almost nil.
Okay, along the lines of what you just indicated, is one of the reasons for Mitch McConnell's reticence at this point all about Georgia and keeping the Republican options alive in Georgia?
To a large degree. If you saw the news conference that McConnell held the day after the election on November 4th, you'd have noticed a couple of things. One, he didn't look particularly unhappy about the likely result. In fact, that may have been I don't think I've ever seen Mitch McConnell smile, but that's about the closest I've ever seen him come to it. And McConnell did indicate at that point, after months of ignoring the negotiations between Nancy Pelosi and Steven Mnuchin over a COVID relief package, he did indicate what he felt was the importance of passing one now. So I interpret that as McConnell understanding that there are things that he can gain and his caucus from gain from working with Biden. But Hank, your point is exactly right, or the questioner's point is exactly right. On January 5th, when those two runoff elections take place in the state of Georgia, those runoffs will be almost entirely a contest of base motivation. There are no undecided voters, or very few undecided voters in a runoff or in a special election. It's all about motivating your most loyal base. And I think McConnell and his team understand that if they appear to be at odds with President Trump, if it looks like they are conceding the election, that could demotivate Georgia Republicans from turning out for Senator Perdue and for Senator Loeffler's reelections. So my guess is that between now and January 5th, McConnell will find ways, albeit quietly, to begin a low level of cooperation. But I don't think we'll see anything visible from him or many other Capitol Hill Republicans until those runoffs have been concluded in early January.
Would the Republican Party in Georgia be better off in terms of the runoff elections, having Biden admitted to be the next president, emphasize to the Republican voters in Georgia the importance of having a check on Biden and selecting their senator? In other words, just the opposite of Mitch McConnell's likely thinking.
Well, right now they're trying to have it both ways. The Republican infrastructure, as it were, is arguing very strongly that the presidential election is not over. Loeffler and Perdue themselves, the candidates themselves, are beginning to refer to themselves as the Republicans' last line of defense. So they're trying to do both. Now, they usually preface that with a just-in-case argument. But on balance, Hank, I think McConnell strategically is right on this one, because the motivational effect of protecting that last bastion of Republican power is probably not as strong as the deflating effect among loyal Republicans and loyal Trump supporters of realizing that their president has lost. So neither is a perfect answer, but I think doing what they can to keep their base motivated in the way that they are strategically probably does make more sense.
Why did Trump do so well with the Black voters?
Well, I'll question the phrase "so well." Donald Trump drew, according to the exit polls, roughly 12% of the African American vote. Now, compared to 2016, when he drew 8%, certainly that is an improvement. But I think you'd have to be pretty optimistic to refer to that as "so well." But what appears to have happened is a couple of things. Is number one, until the coronavirus came to our shores earlier this year, the African American levels of employment in the African American community, like in the broader electorate, were very high. And a small percentage, but a percentage of voters in that community remembered that. Second, there's a percentage of African American voters who prioritize public safety and criminal justice issues from a law enforcement perspective, because particularly for those from more challenged economic circumstances, the threat of crime is something that's not an abstraction, but it's something real that they and their family face on a regular basis. So these aren't large numbers, but small percentages of African American voters did decide on the basis of either economic or public safety issues or both to support Trump. But I wouldn't read too much into a 4% shift unless it's something that continues, a trajectory that continues in the years ahead.
Although Biden ran a good campaign, do you think the Democrats should do anything differently in the 2024 election?
That's a great. It's a great question, and the reason I'm hesitating is I was expecting a slightly different one, Hank. Look, Joe Biden ran the smartest campaign that could ever be run for a candidate with Joe Biden's personal and professional and political biography. He emphasized persuading swing voters, going back to the formulation I was discussing earlier, to a much greater degree than presidential candidates in either party had in many years. And he didn't do that just because he was old school. He did that because he himself was actually somewhat centrist, that he was biographically and dispositionally very well positioned to reach out to these white working class voters, and because Trump essentially conceded the center of the political spectrum to him, no matter who the nominee is in 2024. And even if it were Biden, which I think is less likely, those circumstances won't be duplicated. So the campaign Biden ran was a smart one for him. But if Kamala Harris or Julian Castro or Beto O'Rourke or Bernie Sanders or Kirsten Gillibrand or Amy Klobuchar had run that campaign, it wouldn't have worked for them. So do I think prioritizing swing voters is a smart strategy? It's a smart strategy when you're running against a candidate like Donald Trump who can motivate your base for you. But if in 4 years, if the Republican nominee is Mike Pence, I don't know that Mike Pence will be nearly as motivating a factor for base Democrats to turn out as Trump was, which means that Biden's successor as the party's nominee would almost certainly have to spend more time talking to the party's base than Biden did. What I thought you were going to ask, Hank, and I'll lay it aside in case somebody else decides to, is what should the Democrats do now? Because the internal fighting turning into fratricide between centrists and progressives is getting out of control very, very quickly. And I think the best advice I'd offer to both factions is, as Jesse Jackson said many, many years ago, You need to have two wings on your plane in order for it to fly. And I think as long as either centrist or progressive Democrats look at this as a zero-sum game and believe that the only way to win elections is through their means, no matter what the district, what the constituency, who the candidate, you're going to continue to have this very unproductive back and forth. I think once they realize that both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Alyssa Slotkin both ran the perfect campaigns possible for their respective districts, the sooner they'll stop the internal warring and turn to the common foe on the other side of the aisle.
There was a related question that one of our members asked: will the progressives in the Democratic Party thwart Biden's efforts?
They may. And oddly enough, I think one of the greatest assets Biden will have to keep that from happening is Mitch McConnell. Because if Democrats had comfortable majorities in both chambers, both in the House or the Senate, it would be much more difficult for Biden to go to the progressive base that turned out for him and say, no, I'm not gonna push your agenda. Sorry. What he can say instead now is, in a Senate that is either held by a Republican majority or in which Democrats have only the slimmest 51 to 50 majorities, he can simply say, we can't get your agenda through the Senate. I'll give an example on personnel. There's any number of progressive Democrats who believe that Elizabeth Warren would make the most logical choice for Biden for Secretary of the Treasury. And it's worth noting she'd be the first female Secretary of the Treasury in the country's history. Now, Elizabeth Warren's a brilliant person. But that said, the likelihood of her getting confirmed by a Republican Senate is about as likely as me or you getting confirmed by a Republican Senate. And so for Joe Biden, rather than having to say, no, I just don't want Warren, I'd rather have someone more centrist who reflects my thinking, he can now say, we'll never get Elizabeth Warren through the Senate. So how about Lael Brainerd? How about Janet Yellen? How about someone whose thinking more reflects mine? Anyway, the progressive wing of the party bit their lip a lot over the general election campaign in a way that they didn't do in 2016, because they understood the importance of their party's nominee winning, even if they didn't agree with him on many issues. Now they think the bill has come due. But even if Biden did want to pay that bill, which I'm not convinced he does, the very narrow majorities in Congress, simply prevent him from doing so.
Do you think the Justice Department should or would investigate Trump when he's out of office?
This might be the most difficult challenge that President Biden will face, whether he has the Justice Department continue to investigate Trump on any number of federal level potential crimes. If he does, if he does not allow the Justice Department to pursue this, he's essentially saying that a former president is above the law. On the flip side, if he does instruct the Justice Department to pursue it, he's just made it much, much more difficult for him to achieve his goals of reuniting the country after years of division. If you have a president who wants to make an effort to govern in a somewhat bipartisan way and to try to heal some of these old wounds, prosecuting the former president of the United States is probably not a great way of doing that. I'm not arguing against doing it, but simply pointing out that there are competing priorities on both sides. And Joe Biden's decision, whether, if you'll excuse the expression, to pull a Gerald Ford or not, is probably going to be one of the most important decisions he makes. The one other note I'd offer, though, is even if Biden tells his Justice Department to stand down, there's still a very large number of criminal matters being pursued at local and state courts against the president. Most notably in New York State, in the city of New York. Biden can't prevent those from going forward. And just as an aside, a presidential pardon can relieve the pardonee of any obligations for federal crimes committed. But a president is not constitutionally capable of pardoning someone for local or state convictions. Now, there's a huge constitutional question about whether a president can pardon himself in advance. The other alternative has been speculated is that President Trump would step down on the evening of January 19th, allowing acting President Pence to pardon him before the inauguration the next day. But in any case, even a Trump pardon would not affect any local or state proceedings going against him. So difficult choice for Biden, but either way, Trump is not in the clear by any stretch of the imagination.
Now, did you see any evidence that voter suppression was a significant factor in the past election?
It does not appear so. There certainly are examples of it, but if you look at the exit polling that was done after the election, one of the questions that was asked was if voters had difficulty casting their ballots, and a very, very small percentage. I don't have the poll in front of me, but a very, very small percentage said that there was a significant difficulty attached to them voting. So I understand the concern, but at least statistically, the evidence of it is not widespread.
What can the Democrats do to get white non-college voters to vote for their own economic interests?
Boy, so also a great question. And, we've talked about how decades of trending has brought us to a place where so many Americans vote on cultural and social matters rather than economic matters. The question is, what can the Democrats do to convince working class voters to reverse that? And of course, you could ask the same question of what can Republicans do to bring back those suburban higher income voters who've left them over the years. There's a really smart member of Congress from the state of Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, very much a centrist. And there was a piece written about her in the PLAT'O web publication about a week ago by their reporter, Tim Alberta, who did several stories on Slotkin over the course of this campaign. And he brought this question to her because she represents fairly sizable working class communities. And what was really interesting to me is she talked not about specific matters of public policy, but rather about the tone of approach in voter contact. Now, don't get me wrong, there's policy areas that can do this. Biden is thinking about an infrastructure package, which would be of great benefit to the Democratic Party's ability to reach out to these voters. There's talk in both parties about a child tax credit, which would certainly help in that regard. But Slotkin's argument is fascinating, and I think it's an important one. Because the point that she makes, and I'd encourage anyone who's interested to look up the article on PLAT'O by Tim Alberta about Alyssa Slotkin. She said it's a matter of respect. And what she essentially says, I'm paraphrasing, of course, is there are too many members of our party who who believe so strongly in our goals and in our ideals that they inadvertently talk down and condescend to people who come at these issues in a different way. Now, I always tell my students, I say I've never convinced anyone of anything by telling them how stupid they are. And the point that Slotkin, I think, is making is that a lot of Democratic Party regulars can be somewhat condescending and somewhat off-putting to these working class voters. And that's something that Trump either intentionally or intuitively recognized in 2016, because one of the ways he was able to attract their support is by talking to them in a way that they found to be much more respectful than they heard from many Democrats. There's a famous speech, just to take this point a step further, there's a famous speech that Bill Clinton gave shortly after the Sandy Hook tragedy some years back. And in that speech, Clinton was talking to Democratic National Committee members about the best route to achieve the gun control policy change. And what Clinton said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, this is not his words by any stretch of the imagination. He said, I know a lot of good people. I have a lot of good friends down in my home state of Arkansas. And his point was, he said, our problem, well, first he told the audience, he said, look, I'm with you. I've been with you on assault weapons ban. I've been with you on background checks. But here's our problem. All those good people I know down in Arkansas, they think that we think that they're stupid. And as long as they think that we think that we're stupid, we're not going to be able to have a productive conversation with them about responsible gun legislation that will allow them to protect their guns for hunting and for legitimate self-protection, but will rein in excesses in other areas. And I think one of the problems that leaders in both parties run into is they tend to talk down to people who aren't as vested in these issues as they are. And I think I'll echo Slotkin, the best way to begin to win these voters back is to recognize them as good, decent people who may have different opinions on issues that are important to you, but they still deserve to be treated with respect. I think that's the best way to begin that conversation.
If Roe versus Wade is overturned, will the religious right start voting their wallets and switch to the Democrats?
I doubt it, because if Roe versus Wade is overturned, then of course it becomes a decision to be made in every state in the country. And issues like these aren't going to go away in either direction. Whether you are a working class voter in the rural Central Valley, or a wealthier voter in Beverly Hills or Brentwood, the overturn of Roe versus Wade is not going to make abortion any less of an important issue to you. Simply the venue in which it gets debated, whether it's the state level or in Congress, I think if anything, probably it may intensify feelings and engagement on the issue. One other quick thought on the abortion issue, though, Hank. It's worth noting that not too long after the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg was named to the Supreme Court, she gave a speech. She wrote an article in which she suggested that Roe v. Wade had been decided prematurely. Now, obviously, she was a strong supporter of the court's decision, but her point is that because the court stepped in so early in the debate, that they essentially short-circuited a legislative and political debate on the issue. And it was her feeling, I think there's some validity to it, that had the court let such a contentious issue make its way through the legislative and political process, that wouldn't have made strong feelings go away, but would have allowed them to resolve themselves in a less confrontational manner than an up or down court decision did. I have no idea whether a new 6-3 court is going to overturn it or not, but whether it does, the issue certainly isn't going away. Like I said, if anything, the stakes even get higher.
Earlier, you talked about many of the issues that drove people to vote on election day, but certainly one thing that was very notable is that the Democratic Party urged their base to vote by mail. The Republican Party urged their base to vote in person. Did the mail voting versus in-person voting factor make any significant difference in the ultimate outcome?
Well, we don't know. We know that, of course, that voting turnout was higher than it's been in almost a century. And some of that could be credited to the broader availability of mail voting and early voting. But I don't have any reliable information on whether it impacted the partisan margins or not, simply because what we don't know is how many of those mail voters would have voted in person had they not voted for mail, or how many would have simply not voted at all had the mail option not been available to them. So it certainly helped increase turnout, but I wouldn't be in a position to say whether it helped one party or the other more.
Will Joe Biden try, or should he try, or how can he try to court the religious working class soccer moms and that traditionally have supported Donald Trump?
Well, I think I'll broaden the question a little bit, which is, rather than specifically how can Biden attract support from working class women to how can he attract working class voters? Well, I think a first and important step in that will be a COVID relief package. I think a broader investment in infrastructure, as he's frequently talked about, will be of great value to them. The other thing that Biden does, and it doesn't get much attention in the broader populace, but it's something his campaign did very effectively, is Biden increased his support by several points among evangelical and fundamentalist voters. And he increased his support among Catholic voters by a very large margin. It's not just because he happens to be of the Catholic faith himself, but his campaign very aggressively marketed personal biographical information about Biden to those religious conservative voters. And they talked about him as a churchgoer, as a person of faith. And it was a way of reaching those voters in a way that Democratic candidates in recent years have had more trouble. So some of it's going to be policy, primarily economic growth, and whether it's COVID relief or infrastructure or other reasons. And again, I wouldn't look past the child tax credit, because for a religious conservative voter, that's a particularly important factor in their daily lives and in their budgets. But in addition to the policy, I think Biden's comfort with displaying his own personal religious faith in the right circumstances can do him a great deal of good with those voters.
Why doesn't Biden sue the GSA to require that the law requiring the transition planning to take effect?
Well, I think there's a couple things going on there. I think, number one, the people advising Biden worry understandably that by the time a case like that is resolved, it simply won't be relevant anymore. Second, but more importantly, it's worth noting that as of today, November 19th, correct? As odd as this sounds, nothing official has happened in the election yet. When the networks called the race for Joe Biden on Saturday the 9th, Saturday the 7th, excuse me, that's important because we all recognize it as reality, but there's nothing official about a media organization calling the election results. When Joe Biden gave a speech that evening, essentially accepting the victory, that was a seminal moment, but it wasn't an official one. As we talked about earlier, nothing official happens until the states begin certifying the election results. So starting tomorrow in Georgia and through next week in Pennsylvania and Arizona and Michigan, and the following week in Wisconsin up until December 8th, when all 50 states have certified their results, nothing legal has happened yet. And so my guess is if by December 8th, the formal transition process isn't started, or if by December 14th, when the electors are selected, the process hasn't begun, then I suspect that at that point, a lawsuit makes more sense. Because right now, according to strict legal means, there's nothing to sue over. And so what Biden is instead doing is warning publicly about the dangers of not starting the transition. It's been reported that he and his allies are increasing pressure on Republican elected officials to come around. And it's been reported that many, not only Trump administration alumni, but current administration staff are beginning to have quiet conversations with Biden's advisors. So they don't have everything they need. Obviously, the president-elect would certainly benefit from a daily national security briefing, but they're making progress now in a fairly low-key way. And I think either that December 8th or December 14th threshold would give them the legal grounding that just doesn't exist right now.
When you look at the election results in California, how do you see California trending at this point, both generally and in terms of the future of the Republican Party in California?
I'll answer the second part first because it's easier. The California Republican Party is just simply not relevant in California politics, nor will it be for many years. And in fact, I would predict that the state will have a no-party preference governor before we have before California has its next Republican governor. More broadly, as far as the election results, it reminds me that while the state is blue, and while California is deep blue, it's not indigo. And I wonder if Democratic supermajorities and their allies in Sacramento have overestimated the ideological shift in the state over the last 20 years. It's been considerable, but maybe not quite as far as those who would have put Proposition 15 or 16 or 21 on the ballot might have expected. This is obviously a heavily Democratic state, but the results of 15 and 16 in particular, the property tax initiative and the affirmative action initiative, demonstrate that while Californians lean left, they are still somewhat cautious. And it became clear that they were a little bit reluctant for what they saw as overly dramatic change, the types of things that can probably better be accomplished in a more gradual way.
Okay, how do you see the results of the election in terms of the future of the Republican Party on a national level? Do you see the party continuing to be a Trump party? Do you see other contenders rising to the top? Do you see the party ideologically to stay essentially populist?
At the risk of avoiding the question, because I'm not very good at predictions, what I do foresee is an immense internal brawl within the Republican Party for its future between what we'll call the pro-Trumpers, those who would like to see the party continue to operate under the imprint that the current president has put on it, and what we can call the pre-Trumpers, the more traditional conservatives who either stood up as never-Trumpers or who quietly acceded. And the fight for the 2024 presidential nomination, especially if Donald Trump himself does not run, is going to be not just a fierce fight, but it's going to be almost a definitional fight, because candidates on one side like Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence or Tom Cotton or Donald Trump Jr. represent a much different type of Republican Party, a Donald Trump Republican Party, than a Marco Rubio or a Ben Sasse or a Nikki Haley might, who was more likely to represent that pre-Trump, a Bush-Romney Republican Party. I won't pretend for a minute to know which faction will win, but I will say it's going to be much more difficult for that traditional conservative wing to reemerge as long as Trump himself remains prominent, if not dominant, on the political landscape. That doesn't mean it can't happen. It just becomes much more difficult. But you'll see a fight between those pro-Trumpers and pre-Trumpers that makes the current fight in the Democratic Congressional Caucus between progressives and centrists look like a garden party by comparison.
So what you're saying is that the Lincoln Project has a future in the elections coming up for the next 4 years.
The Lincoln Project, and some of these are my friends, made an interesting decision this year when they decided not just to take on Donald Trump, but to take on Republicans in down-ticket races as well. And their argument was that in order to truly defeat Trumpism, you needed to defeat his enablers and supporters as well. But I think it might be harder for them to play as influential a role as they'd like, not because of the fight they took against Trump, but the fact that they broadened that fight to against other Republicans as well. They're a group of smart people. They'll be a vital part of the political conversation going forward, but they have a lot more fences to mend in the Republican Party now because they chose to broaden the scope of their efforts.
What can Trump do during his remaining term, in addition to appointing judges, that will be difficult for Biden to undo?
Well, where to start? First of all, yeah, undoing is just a tricky word in this context. Well, I'll give you one example. So this administration is not doing very much on COVID right now. Will Joe Biden implement a much more aggressive COVID relief program once taking office? Of course he will. And so to some degree that will redirect previous efforts. But that doesn't bring back the lives of people whose lives were lost before he was able to do that. Trump has announced recently, as all of you know, that he is reducing the US military presence in Afghanistan and Iraq very considerably. Can Biden send those troops back? Sure, he can, but there are logistical and political obstacles in his way that will make it difficult for him to do it immediately. Trump is putting additional sanctions on Iran and perhaps on China between now and the time he leaves office. Can Biden remove those sanctions? Sure, but it can't be done overnight. It's a long and complicated process. So most legislative and policy actions can be undone, but the real world practical impact of those policy decisions can't be reversed. So legislative and from a policy standpoint, of course Biden can, but he can't simply erase the last 4 years of the impact that it's had, for bad or for good, on the American people or on people in other parts of the world.
Laws and government shape and have been shaped by recurrent crises of infectious diseases. Your perspective, how will the current COVID-19 pandemic influence the laws and governance in the 21st century?
Well, I think at least for the immediate future, it will not only invigorate, but I think fairly dramatically change the discussion over healthcare policy. That's not to say that a universal healthcare is any closer now than it was in February. And given the balance in the Senate, even a Biden public option is probably going to be pretty difficult. But if it does lead to a more, even if it's a two-way debate between the two parties about the best way to broaden availability of healthcare in an affordable way, then that is something that's more reasonable to expect. The other thing to keep in mind as it relates to COVID, and of course the other policy area before I shift is on the international front. This country was already trending very, very aggressively from an internationalist to an isolationist approach. That's not something that Trump caused. It's something that he accelerated, but it predated the president. And it is worth noting that 4 years ago in the 2016 campaign, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton opposed, for example, the United States entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. I worry that the experience we've had with COVID is going to deepen those isolationist sentiments. And even if Biden's natural instincts are more internationalist and more multilateralist, he's going to have a very tough time with the body politic moving us back in that direction, because the memories of this crisis are going to be so fresh. The biggest difference, though, I think, is not going to be policy. Rather, I think it's going to be cultural. We've lived in a very rarefied set of circumstances in this country. And I realize that many, many people live in economically disadvantaged circumstances. So I don't mean to minimize those at all. But it's been a century since we faced this kind of broad health scare. Even the polio scare of the 1950s didn't come anywhere near this. And I don't know how to predict what the cultural impact's going to be, but I know that my grandparents who survived the Great Depression were always shaped by that experience. I know my relatives who survived the Holocaust spent the rest of their lives dramatically impacted by that experience. I know people who experienced the terrorist attacks of September 11th from close up, particularly those who suffered family or friends losses because of it. Their lives were always changed. I don't know what the COVID-based cultural and societal change is going to be, but it's probably going to be more considerable and longer lasting than policy or legislative change.
We noticed in this past election, obviously, a huge increase in the number of people who voted. In your opinion, what stimulated the intensity of the enthusiasm? What factors went into it? Did social media play a role?
The biggest factor was Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not only commander-in-chief, he's the motivator-in-chief. We talked earlier about how much he's motivated his own base of support to turn out at unprecedented levels. Well, he clearly turned out his opponent's core base of support to turn out at unprecedented levels also. And as such a polarizing figure, depending on where you sit, either as a good or a bad thing, was so polarizing that I think he single-handedly motivated a much larger turnout from the right to the left and back again. And while we can talk about social media, while we can talk about voting by mail, ultimately these are tools. And it's simply Donald Trump's presence on the national stage, I believe, that led to such a considerably higher turnout than we've seen in so many years.
One of our members asked, how has the politicalization of the media affected the outcome of elections?
Wow, another great question. I know I sound like a broken record, but that's because, as usual, PLATO members come up with some really great questions. The partisanization of the media has had a very important impact, and it's not a great one. Barack Obama wrote about this in his memoirs, which I have not yet read, but I've read the reviews of them, and this is something he talks about a little bit. Is when media acts not just in a role of providing information, but as an active advocate on one side or the other, it allows us to sort of self-select the news and information we access. Way back in 2000, back in the early years of common internet access and long before social media, before Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, Nick Kristof, the New York Times columnist, wrote a phenomenal piece, this is 20 years ago, called The Me Network, The Me Network. And he pointed to the internet and to cable TV and to talk radio is allowing us, once again, my words, not his, to construct an information environment that never challenged us, that never disagreed with us, that only reinforced what we already believed and congratulated us for being smart enough to believe it. And when it becomes that much easier for any of us on the right or the left to live in what I would call an information igloo, then the person who disagrees with you isn't a principled opponent. They're not a smart person who just happens to have come to a different conclusion about how to solve a public policy challenge than I have. No, that person is stupid. They're evil. They're the enemy, because the only time we're ever exposed to them is when they're held up as a matter of caricature. So I do think advocacy-based media, cable, talk radio, and particularly online and social media, has reinforced those natural human tendencies. And social media in particular, the algorithms that Facebook and Google and others use are designed very specifically to feed us news and information that is going to play to our existing beliefs. What I will say is this, since I realize I'm sounding like a druid or a Cassandra or something, is I believe that the benefits of the advances in communications technology that have taken place over the last quarter century far outweigh the downsides. These advances, they empower us in a way that no generation of voters has ever been empowered before, not just to communicate back to power, but to communicate and organize with each other. But as Uncle Ben said in the first Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility. And what that means is that instead of Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley or Dan Rather or Peter Jennings deciding what is news and what isn't, it's up to each of us to decide that for ourselves. And the advice I give my students, I say, if something you find online seems too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. And go look at another source to see if you can find. The one other point I'd make on this, because it's such an important point and it's such a great question, is while I do sound like some kind of technological doomsayer, we're zealots, we're retreating into our ideological igloos, all the rest of it, I think it is worth noting, to offer a bit of historical perspective, that the second half of the 20th century, when it comes to news media, was an absolute and total aberration in human history. Because from the mid-20th century, from the time when television became pervasive in American society, to the end of the century when the internet became pervasive, that's the only time in human history in which an oligarchy controlled the dissemination of news and information. The television era, as it were, was controlled by 3 broadcast networks. And they decided, not for civic reasons, but for business reasons, the best thing for them to do was to present as broad-based and even-handed a presentation of news and information as possible to reach the broadest possible audience. Well, in the internet era, each website doesn't have to reach that broad, large audience. they can talk to a much more specific, much more targeted audience, either with specific interest on issues, on recreation, or on opinion. And if you think about it, the newspapers that existed in our country in the 19th and first half of the 20th century very much worked along the same business model. In most big cities, there were 8, 9, 10 newspapers, each of which catered to a very specific ideological or cultural swath of society. And so that break in the second half of the 20th century, when TV took over, was the aberration. What we're going back to now is the same thing we saw previous, which is many, many, many news platforms, each targeting very specific slices of the electorate. Somehow I think if our forebears in the 19th and early 20th century could find a way to navigate it, we will too. But right now, it's simply human nature to want to talk to and listen to and learn from the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? Well, they're the people who agree with me. And some of us identify those people on Fox News, some of us identify those people on MSNBC. But I think the challenge for all of us is to realize that while it's more comfortable and reassuring to construct that ideological igloo and a very insular ideological community in which to live, it's a lot more productive to take a risk, to take some chance, to take a step out of that safety zone and be willing to engage with people with whom you disagree.
What do you see in terms of the state of our democracy and in the future with the distrust in the election process that's now unfolding?
Well, the good news in my mind is that as deep as the divisions and as deep as the distrust in societies we now face, we've been here before. This is not unique in American history. And for those of you who haven't read it, I'd recommend the fine John Meacham book, The Soul of America. And to be fair, Meacham was using that phrase before Joe Biden started using it as a campaign theme. And Meacham in his book point out that these periods of division and distrust and hatred have existed in our country since even before we were a country. And the phenomenal thing about the book is he doesn't just recount what those instances were. He talks through how we got past them in previous times. And some of it's fairly obvious. The Lincolns, the Roosevelts, the Kings, and so on. A lot of it's less obvious though. Really improbable leaders and really improbable men and women stepping forward to help us get past those divisions. And so I'm very optimistic that if it's something we've been able to do many, many times in our nation's past, that we'll be able to do it again, as long as there are good men and women like the community leaders who populate organizations like PLAT'O, who are willing to say, yeah, I know it's a lot more comfortable spending my whole life with people who agree with me, but I need to be willing to reach out and talk to people who don't, because that's the way you knit a broken society back together. Ian Bremmer, the brilliant international geopolitical analyst, sent out a tweet a couple days after the election. And in the tweet he said, every Biden voter should get on the phone, should make a phone call to a Trump voter who they know and talk with them and see if you can find one issue on which you agree. Now, for some that sounds difficult, for some that could be painful. But I think it's, while slightly exaggerated, it's wonderful advice because it's a terrific reminder that ultimately, if we are going to get past these levels of distrust, it's not going to come from Washington, D.C. It's not going to come from Sacramento. It's going to be because friends and neighbors and work colleagues realize that someone who happens to belong to a different political party isn't stupid or evil, but they're a reasonably intelligent person and concerned citizen who cares just as much about fixing our society's challenges as we do, even if they have a slightly different way of doing it.
The one final question, which is somewhat related to what you're just talking about, the polarization of the electorate using several metrics continues to grow. What are the implications on this and on the elections and governance generally? And if so, how can this be reversed?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at public opinion polling, those dramatic polar opposites keep growing, when it comes to partisan identification and candidate preferences. That's not necessarily the case on public policy matters. It is on some, but certainly not on all. And I'll look at Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell as avatars for this conversation, because I think it is worth noting that while both are proud partisans, that throughout the Obama administration, whenever Barack Obama and Republican congressional leadership could not come together, often it was left to Biden and McConnell to disappear into a room, and much to the consternation of the base of both of their parties, to fashion some kind of middle ground that was not the first choice of either, but was ultimately workable for both. And I do think, and I'm an optimist, but not an ingenue, and I think McConnell is not going to work with Biden on all issues, or even on most. But I think on some, you can find that common ground. I've mentioned them earlier. I think you can find common ground on COVID relief. I think you can find common ground on an infrastructure package. I think you can find common ground on some immigration policy and on a child tax credit. I think you can even find some common ground in the climate change area, perhaps not on regulatory matters, but almost certainly in investments in alternative energies and green technology. And I think in foreign policy, you still have, as isolationist as the extremes of both parties have become, is you still have an internationalist base closer to the center aisle in both parties as well. And so the hyperpartisanship that the questioner asks about, it exists, but it exists primarily on self-identification from a partisan basis and candidate preference. On issues, that middle ground does exist if we choose to take advantage of it. Last point I'll make, because I know we're running out of time, Hank, is I recommended Meacham's book to you a minute ago. Let me close by recommending two other books that I'm assigning to my classes this semester for the first time. One is a book called Why We're Polarized by the progressive journalist Ezra Klein. The other is a book that is simply called Them by Ben Sasse, the conservative senator. And my joke in class is that they're the same book because they both warn about the dangers of hyperpolarization from opposite sides of the aisle. And what both of them advise, using much, much different language, is they talk in the construct of identity politics. And both say in very, very different ways that being proud of one's identity in the political sphere or elsewhere is absolutely commendable. But what they both warn, using very different language and different examples, is that when you define your identity in a singular way, you define your identity based on one single point, whether it's gender, whether it's age, whether it's race, whatever it is, that's when politics can become very insular and very exclusionary and very confrontational. But Sasse and Klein remind us that we're all made up of multiple identities. And if we're willing to do an inventory of our multiple identities, it becomes a lot easier to find common ground with someone who seems like a polar opposite. Because the more aspects of my identity I reflect on, the more likely I am to find one that I share with someone on the other side of the aisle. So can we get past it? Sure. As long as we remember that we're not just single issue partisans, but that we're really complex human beings. And we've got a lot more in common with people who vote for other candidates than most of us are usually willing to admit.
Dan, thank you so very, very much. As usual, your presentation was fabulous. And, you are one of there's a reason why you are probably the most popular speaker we have during our Colloquium series. And for our PLAT'O members, I look forward to having you join us again January 21st, when our speaker will be Brian Taylor, who is a professor of urban planning and public policy at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and where he is the director of the Institute of Transportation Studies, addressing what is a problem that we will once again be facing soon as we have a vaccine, namely, can the LA traffic problem be solved? So until traffic gets back to normal, let's figure out some strategies. And Dan, thank you again for joining us. And thank you all among the PLAT'O members for joining us again this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Hank. And thanks so much to everyone for letting me join you today. I really appreciate it.